Welcome back. We've had Donald Trump when we had all the back and forth about emails. He said, if you've got something important, you can't trust it to electronic delivery. Write it down on a piece of paper and deliver it. Well, one of the most important communications you can have when it comes to government is your vote. We need to have an audit trail at the very least. We hear all of this information about the election being hacked by Russians, and yet when real hacking of our election system is involved, no one is interested except InfoWars. And we've been covering issues here in the state of Texas that also apply nationwide. Here in Texas, we have situations where our requirements under law to number ballots and many other requirements to make sure that we have an audit trail to make sure that the ballots cannot be stuffed have been ignored. And we have joining us today Dr. Laura Pressley. In a race that you were in, Laura, you found evidence of tampering, essentially, and you had concerns about the number of votes, and of course that goes to the requirement of numbering the ballot. And you wanted to do an audit of this, and you found that the 4 different areas that are required under Texas law to be able to do audits of electronic ballots were being ignored, and they were being shut down by the Texas Director of Elections. He had directly countermanded the law, and there was a very interesting back and forth when you appealed this to the local authorities, and of course it had to be appealed in the same jurisdiction where they were shutting down the law, and they found that they had not done anything wrong, surprisingly. But there was an interesting back and forth question that reminded me of the Nuremberg trials. That, well, if can a director of elections tell you to shut down, to ignore the law? And they said, oh, absolutely, totally.
Right. So, I think it's brand new information when a bureaucrat in state government can tell counties to ignore the absolutely most important thing we have in a government, and that's laws regarding election integrity and laws that are protecting our backup records for electronic voting. So, I ran for city council, and, something was just going wrong, David, with our race and all the results that we got. We saw statistical, mathematical patterns, but that stuff gets you so far. A lot of people around the country see statistical patterns, theories about how elections can be stolen with an electronic voting machine. But what we got in our case was phenomenal. We got actually hard evidence of corruption, how main computers can be corrupted with this electronic voting. And it doesn't take the Russians. It doesn't require an internet connection. All it requires is a memory card that can be. And
we've seen this demonstrated on television for a decade or more.
Yes.
People walk in and they stick in a thumb drive into the system.
Yes.
It puts some software on there. It alters all the votes. So we've seen this over and over again on news reports. And then after all the voting is done and they've tabulated everything, then it essentially erases itself so you can't detect that.
That's right.
And if you don't have an audit process, that's one of the reasons why in the Texas law, when they were concerned about that, everybody knows that you can manipulate the electronics, and so they wanted to have ways that they could go back and audit this. And when we talk about the corruption, I think it begins with this political corruption, where you can have state officials say, well, the law says to do this, but I say to do something else. And then everybody down the line basically says, yeah, that's fine, I don't have to obey the law, I'm obeying him. That's a very dangerous situation, and that's been allowed to happen here in Texas. And of course, you remember, we went back, when was it? It was about a year and a half ago.
It was in October that you
was. Yeah, it was October. Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Before the November election.
So much has happened. It seems like a longer time. But we went to Keith Ingram here, who's the director of elections in Texas, to ask him some of these questions. Why have you, for several years, been directing all the different counties to ignore these laws and these requirements to allow us to have an image of the ballot, to have the ballots numbered and so forth? And he came down. I guess he thought we were going to do a puff piece. How many people are going to show up for the election? Are people interested and buzzed about this election, whatever? And you can see there in the video, he starts to come down, and he sees me there with the InfoWars microphone, and he stops, and he goes, oh, no. Oh, no. And he turns around and he starts walking up.
I love it.
He starts walking up. So we went over and shouted some questions at him, but he didn't answer. So we're looking for answers. And when you go to this court, the amazing thing, too, about this, to me, Dr. Pressley, is the fact that they would say that, no, we think that we're doing nothing wrong. And if you appeal this, we're going to hit you with a $40,000 personal fine and your lawyer with a $50,000 fine if you appeal this. And you did it anyway. Good for you.
That's right.
And then you lost again in a local, here again in Austin, and they hit you with another $25,000 fine. So then your response is, well, I'm going to go to the Supreme Court. You're not taking a no for an answer here.
I'm not taking no for an answer because I believe our elections are the absolute most important thing we have in our government and in this country. If we don't have honest and fair elections, we can lose the First Amendment. Yes. We can lose the Second Amendment. We can lose all of them. So this is where the buck stops with the people. And, you know, it's interesting, David. The only way that electronic voting fraud can occur and be perpetuated is when you don't have a backup record. And so, and just exactly what you said in Texas, the Texas Secretary of State's office, the elections director, Mr. Ingram, has been giving waivers to law and also certifying electronic voting equipment that doesn't even meet state law or the federal standards. And so again, the only way fraud can occur is if you're ignoring all these backup records that are required. You know, if you have all the backup records, you can't steal an election as easily, right?
Let's talk about the centerpiece of this, because you're an election integrity technologist, a strategist. You've gone through the details of this. Let's take a look at the specifics here now. In this particular, in the Texas Constitution, it provides for the numbering of tickets and ballots. This is something that's been here for 120 years. Even when we just had a paper system, they were numbered. And as you pointed out before the interview began, we were talking here individually, you said, all the dollar bills that we have are serially numbered. Why is that? Because you want to have some control over counterfeiting. And they knew that for the paper ballots. And then they continued that, especially with additional requirements when they went to electronics.
That's right. You know, the Texas Constitution, all the way back to the 1800s, has required that a ballot be numbered. And that is the first and most primary basic fraud prevention methodology. You know, fraud's been going on a long time in Texas, right? So even in the 1800s, we knew to number a ballot. So that's the first thing that's been required. So, you know, so the Constitution requires it. And we have these electronic voting systems in Texas that don't meet the numbering requirement. And
they're not just Texas systems. These are national vendors. So it's going to be the same vendors nationally, same vendors internationally. I mean, quite frankly, one of the companies that operates here in the United States, Smartmatic, began in Venezuela with cronies of Hugo Chavez. And these guys created the electronic ballot system so they could make sure that Hugo Chavez took control. And there has been massive fraud throughout Central and South America and the Philippines due to this particular company's systems. And there's other companies that are associated with it. And now we've got Hart Systems, which operates here in Texas and many places in the United States. They don't even have the capability, never have had the capability of doing numbering. And they're not hiding that. They just have the politicians who like them for some reason or the other. They like these electronic systems. And so they buy their stuff, even though it doesn't meet the legal requirements.
That's right. And you know, then that's really what our case is about. Our case that's in the Texas Supreme Court right now references that ballots have to be numbered per the state constitution. And actually, there's case law all the way back for 120 years, from 2011 all the way back to the 1800s, that say ballots have to be numbered. Even electronic ballots are required to be numbered, and that was the case in 2011. And so you have to have a numbered ballot. And why is that important? Well, you have to have a number because let's say you vote and you've identified that your ballot on the electronic voting machine is ballot number 452. And let's say there's a candidate that does a recount and you go back in and go, okay, my ballot's number 452. Gosh, that's not who I voted for. Then there is proof, David,
that's right,
of fraud. And so that's why the numbering really is the holy grail of election integrity. And so this requirement's been there back to the 1800s in Texas. And even the federal standards require that the electronic ballots have a unique identifier. Well, that's not the case. So
now this is moving forward. You've had these setbacks at the local area where the same jurisdiction where this happened, you were concerned about it. They shut it down, threatened you, put fines against you. But now this is being picked up, and that's why we're talking about this, going to the Texas Supreme Court. So we're out of time for today, but we're going to be following this very closely. You should follow this as well. It is a very important story nationally. We just talked yesterday with Gary Haven talking about how there was a 9-point spread for Hillary Clinton, paper versus electronic ballots in California. And that was done by Stanford University doing that kind of research. It is the key to dishonest or honest government. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Laura Pressley.
Thank you, David.